There is a name that echoes through history, like a warning Machiavelli, not spoken with admiration, but with suspicion. His name alone conjures images of manipulation, of cold-hearted strategy, of a mind scheming in the dark corners of power. To call someone Machiavellian is an insult, a way of saying they're dangerous, untrustworthy, even evil. What if that reputation is wrong? What if the truth is far more uncomfortable not because it's darker, but because it's honest? Niccolò Machiavelli didn't invent cruelty. He didn't invent power, games, betrayal, or control. He simply described them plainly, openly, and without illusion. And that is precisely what made people afraid. Because for all our talk of values and virtues, most people don't want to look directly at how the world truly works. They prefer stories. He gave them a mirror instead. The shadow over Machiavelli didn't come from what he did, but from what he revealed. He wrote in a time of chaos. Italy in the 15th century was not a land of peace and philosophy. It was fragmented, violent, unstable. City-states turned against each other, alliances shifted like sand, and betrayal wasn't the exception, it was the rule. Princes rose and fell in days, heads rolled in the piazza. And Machiavelli, the diplomat, stood in the center of it all, watching, listening, learning. He saw too much to believe in the fairy tales of idealism. He saw that good men often lost, that being honest could get you killed, that kindness, when used without wisdom, was often punished by the very people it tried to save. And so he wrote, not to flatter, not to preach, but to warn. This is what power is, he seemed to whisper. This is what people are, not what they pretend to be, but what they become when masks fall away. And that made him dangerous, because he exposed something we all participate in, but rarely admit, that behind the rituals of morality often lies a much colder reality of self-interest, fear, and control. His book The Prince didn't encourage evil, it dissected it. He laid power on the table like a surgeon with a blade, no judgment, just truth. But truth, when spoken without apology, can feel like an attack. The church banned his works. Moralists called him the devil. The word Machiavellian became shorthand for ruthless cunning. Yet, if you actually read his words, not the interpretations, not the rumors, but his own voice, you won't find a monster. You'll find a man who saw through the illusions of his time, who understood that men are not angels, that leadership is not sainthood, and that in the arena of power, appearances often matter more than intentions. He understood something else, too, something most miss, that knowledge of darkness does not make you dark. In fact, it may be the only way to remain truly awake. Machiavelli was not evil, he was honest. And honesty, when it threatens the stories we cling to, always feels like heresy. This is the shadow of Machiavelli, not cast by him, but projected onto him, by a world too afraid to face its own reflection. And maybe, just maybe, that's why his name still lives. Not as a villain, but as the only one in the room who dared to say, this is how it really is. Tea is easy to sit in comfort, centuries later, and pass judgment on the words of Machiavelli. It is easy to believe that in our world of rules, laws, and polished morality, his vision of power belongs to some distant, barbaric past. But that illusion dissolves the moment you step into the world he actually lived in. Italy in the late 15th and early 16th century was not a peaceful land of philosophy and art, not for men like Machiavelli. It was a battlefield in disguise, a chessboard soaked in blood. Florence, Venice, Milan, Rome, these were cities surrounded by beauty, but built on fragile alliances, ambition, and violence. Machiavelli grew up in Florence, a city as brilliant as it was brutal. The Renaissance was blooming, but its light was sharp, casting long shadows. Behind the frescoes of Botticelli, behind the domes and sculptures, there were secret councils plotting assassinations. Families rose to power through cunning and force, only to fall in a single night. Friends became enemies. Allies turned to traitors. Mercy was rare. Betrayal was survival. It was not a world for idealists. Machiavelli was a diplomat, a man sent to negotiate with princes, popes, warlords. He stood in the courts of Cesare Borgia, a man many believed to be the living embodiment of cruelty and ambition. But Machiavelli didn't look away. He studied him, watched him not with hatred but with curiosity. This is what shaped him. He realized something few are willing to admit, that power has its own laws, that politics is not governed by what should be, but by what is, and so he stopped pretending. While others spoke in platitudes about virtue and honor, he observed the raw movements of fear, greed, loyalty, and ambition. He was not glorifying cruelty, he was mapping its terrain. Machiavelli understood that goodness without strength was weakness. That kindness without wisdom was a danger not just to the leader, but to everyone who depended on them. He saw men who ruled with softness and trust fall prey to predators. He saw that cruelty, when used sparingly and with purpose, could prevent greater chaos and bloodshed. This was not morality, it was survival. His world forced him to look at life naked, stripped of ideals. In Florence, leaders didn't lose elections, they lost their lives. Power was not a game of ethics. It was a storm you either learned to navigate or were destroyed by. He wrote The Prince, not as a manifesto of evil, but as a guide to reality, to protect those foolish enough to believe that good intentions were enough, to prepare them for a world that didn't care about their innocence. This is why Machiavelli seems so cold to modern readers, because he refused to lie. He didn't romanticize the world. He didn't comfort his readers with empty hope. He didn't say, "Be good and you will triumph." He said, "See the world as it is and act accordingly." And yet, in this brutal honesty, there is a strange compassion. Because what is more compassionate, to tell people a comforting lie, or to give them the tools to survive a hard truth? What is more valuable, empty virtue or clear vision? Machiavelli lived in a world of masks, but he chose to write without one. He understood something timeless, that to navigate life, not just politics, you must first learn to look without flinching. The world he lived in demanded this clarity. Perhaps so does ours. Few books in history have been more misunderstood or more feared than The Prince. It is whispered about like a forbidden text, condemned as a handbook for tyrants, accused of teaching deception, cruelty, and betrayal. But like all things born from fear, this reputation tells us more about its readers than its writer. Because The Prince is not what you think. To understand this book, you must first understand who Machiavelli wrote it for and why. He did not write it for monsters. He did not write it for soulless manipulators looking to dominate the weak. He wrote it for survivors. for rulers who stood on the edge of chaos, facing a world that would devour them the moment they hesitated. He wrote it for those who had already seen the mask of civilization slip, who knew that behind the polished words of diplomacy often waited betrayal. It was a manual for those trapped in the brutal reality of Renaissance Italy, not a dream world of philosophers, but a battlefield of shifting loyalties, hidden knives, and fragile power. When Machiavelli wrote The Prince, he was already in disgrace, exiled from Florence, tortured, cast out from the world of politics he had devoted his life to. He had nothing left to lose except the truth. And so he wrote. He wrote not as a moralist, but as an observer. As a man who had spent his life studying the patterns of power, watching princes rise and fall not because they were good or bad, but because they understood reality, or they didn't. The prince is brutal not because Machiavelli admired cruelty, but because he refused to lie about how the game was played. It is not a book of evil, it is a book of strategy, a mirror held up to power stripped of illusions. Machiavelli speaks openly about difficult truths, that it is often safer for a ruler to be feared than loved because love is fragile, but fear is reliable, that generosity, when abused, leads to ruin, not respect, that enemies should be destroyed completely because mercy left unfinished breeds revenge, that appearances matter because people rarely see the truth beneath the surface. But none of this means Machiavelli celebrated darkness for its own sake. He was not a sadist, he was a realist. He knew that power itself is neutral like fire. It can warm, it can destroy. It depends on the hand that wields it. And The Prince was his attempt to teach rulers how to survive without illusions, not how to become villains. But perhaps what unsettles readers most is not his analysis of rulers, but of people. Machiavelli knew the uncomfortable secret of human nature. That men are not always loyal, that promises are easily broken, that fear often moves people faster than love, that virtue alone rarely protects the innocent. And so he dared to write what many knew but would never say. This is how people really are. Not in their best moments, but in their weakest, in times of war, in the face of power, in the struggle for survival. This honesty is what gave The Prince its dark reputation. It is what made Machiavelli a symbol of evil in the eyes of those who preferred comforting illusions over difficult truths. But if you read carefully without fear, without prejudice, you find something else in his words. You find clarity. You find a mind unafraid to describe the world as it is, not as we wish it to be. And in that clarity there is power, not the power of domination, but the power of awareness. Machiavelli was not teaching how to conquer the world. He was teaching how not to be conquered by it. Most thinkers of his time cloaked their words in robes of virtue. They wrote as if man were noble by default, as if society were guided by reason and justice, as if truth and goodness were natural companions. But Machiavelli walked into the crowded room of philosophy and shattered the stained glass window. He said what others dared not. People are not always good. And they do not always want what is right, even when they say they do. He held up a mirror not to what we hope to be, but to what we are. It wasn't cruelty, it was clarity. Machiavelli understood that beneath the surface of every polite society lies something raw, something ancient: fear, desire, ambition, the need to belong, the instinct to protect what is ours, even at the expense of others, and perhaps most of all the tendency to hide these impulses behind masks of civility. He was not condemning people for this, he was revealing the machinery beneath the skin. While other thinkers asked how society should function, Machiavelli asked how it does, and what he saw was not evil but contradiction. People want peace, but crave power. They praise mercy, but reward strength. They say they value honesty, but follow confidence even when it deceives. He said, without apology, men are quick to forget favors, but never an injury. They admire boldness more than virtue. They fear punishment more than they value truth. He wasn't cynical, he was exact. Because he had watched it unfold in courtrooms, in councils, in backroom whispers. He had seen leaders try to govern with idealism alone, only to be destroyed by those more cunning, more ruthless, or simply more aware of how people behave when their survival is at stake. It was not a theory, it was a pattern. And yet, in every line of his analysis, there is not hate, but acceptance. Like a doctor who does not resent the sickness, but seeks to understand it, Machiavelli approached human nature without sentimentality. He did not dream of angels, he worked with what was real. And in doing so, he offered something rare, not hope, not comfort, but a kind of inner freedom. Because when you understand human nature, you stop being surprised by it. You begin to see why betrayal happens, why loyalty fades, why fear works, and how to defend yourself against these forces without collapsing into despair. You begin to forgive others for being human, and yourself too. This is why his writing still feels relevant, even in a world that claims to be more advanced, more moral, more enlightened. Because the masks may have changed, but the faces beneath them have not. We still fear being excluded, we still crave recognition, we still trust appearances, we still lie to ourselves more than anyone else ever could. Machiavelli did not create this nature, he simply refused to look away from it. And that is what made him dangerous. Not his ideas, but his refusal to pretend. In his honesty, there is power, a power that doesn't depend on domination, but on understanding, on seeing the world and its people clearly, without hate, without fantasy, without fear. He knew that truth is rarely what we want to hear, but always what we need to know. And he offered it not as judgment, but as a mirror, not to shame us, but to awaken us. Perhaps the greatest mistake people make when reading Machiavelli is believing he was trying to destroy morality, but he wasn't. He was trying to separate it from something it does not belong to power. Machiavelli understood something that still terrifies the modern mind. Power is not moral. It does not follow the rules of ethics. It does not reward kindness. It does not punish cruelty. Power follows its own gravity indifferent to what we believe is good or evil. This is why his words cut so deeply, because we want to believe that the world rewards virtue. We want to believe that goodness rises naturally to the top, that justice is the force behind history. But Machiavelli lived in a world that proved otherwise, and if we are honest, so do we. He did not say that morality was worthless. He did not say that people should abandon virtue. He said that morality belongs to the private life, to the soul, to relationships, to inner values. But power belongs to the world of consequences. He made a dangerous distinction, and that is why he was hated. He wrote, A man who wants to act entirely virtuously in every way will come to ruin among so many who are not virtuous. Not because virtue has no value, but because power is a field of conflict, not of ideals. This was not a celebration of evil, it was a survival guide. Machiavelli knew that a good man could rule, but only if he also understood the rules of power. Only if he was willing to defend what mattered, to use strength when necessary, to protect his people not just with love, but with wisdom. He wasn't teaching corruption, he was teaching clarity. In this way, Machiavelli may have been one of the most ethical thinkers of his time, not because he gave people false hope, but because he refused to lead them into slaughter with naive idealism. There is a cruelty in false promises. There is a greater kindness in preparing people for reality. His writings echo a principle lost on many. To be moral in an immoral world, you must be wise. To protect good people, you must understand how bad people think. To preserve peace, you must know how war begins. Machiavelli separated power from morality, not to destroy ethics, but to preserve them where they mattered most, in human dignity, in personal integrity, in the sacred spaces of life untouched by politics. He knew that politics is not about what should happen, it is about what does happen. To ignore this is not noble, it is dangerous. To see clearly, that is strength. And so he wrote for those brave enough to look, for those who understood that morality is a compass, not a shield, that virtue is lived in action, not assumed in ignorance. That real leadership demands more than goodness, it demands wisdom. This is why Machiavelli has survived for centuries, not as a prophet of evil, but as a prophet of reality. A man who saw power without illusions. A man who separated the sacred from the strategic, not to destroy either, but to protect both. Centuries have passed since Machiavelli wrote The Prince, yet the world still reacts to his name like a curse. His ideas are taught in whispers, dissected with disclaimers, buried beneath layers of apology. But the more we try to distance ourselves from him, the more obvious the truth becomes. We are still living in the world he described, and perhaps, more than ever, we are still pretending not to. We like to believe we've evolved, that modern society has outgrown the brutal truths of Machiavelli's time, that democracy, globalization, and progress have rendered his thinking obsolete. But look closer. Behind the screens, behind the polished speeches, behind the marketing and messaging and media masks, what do you find? The same mechanisms he spoke of, only dressed in new clothes. Fear still moves people faster than reason. Image still outweighs substance. Leaders still rise not because they are virtuous, but because they are persuasive. Empires still fall through internal weakness, masked as moral superiority. The strategies of power have not changed, only the language surrounding them. And that is exactly what Machiavelli warned against, language used to obscure, not to reveal. We live in a time where appearances are more important than ever, where moral posturing often replaces meaningful action, where being seen as good has replaced being good, where leaders speak of compassion while manipulating with precision, where ideals are weaponized and sincerity is packaged for profit. Machiavelli would not be surprised. He would recognize it all and perhaps even smile at the irony, because the world condemned him for saying what now seems painfully obvious, that power follows different rules than personal virtue. That understanding this isn't cynicism, It's the beginning of wisdom. And yet, we still resist him, still cling to the myth that the world should behave the way we wish it did, still flinch from the idea that someone could speak the truth about human nature without despair and without apology. What have we failed to learn? We have failed to learn that pretending people are better than they are doesn't make them so. We have failed to learn that ignoring power structures doesn't dismantle them. It only blinds us to how they operate. We have failed to learn that naivete is not purity. It is a kind of negligence. We have failed to learn that the refusal to confront reality is not courage. It is fear dressed in virtue. Machiavelli's lesson was never to abandon ethics. It was to stop hiding behind them. He never said cruelty was good. He said it was real, and when used without understanding, even kindness becomes dangerous, even peace becomes fragile, even morality becomes a mask. What we still haven't learned is that facing darkness doesn't make us dark, it makes us prepared, and that a truly ethical world cannot be built on denial, but on deep awareness of what truly moves human beings. We don't need to agree with everything Machiavelli said to hear the value in his voice, because he wasn't speaking to tyrants. He was speaking to those who wanted to survive without lying to themselves. And if we had listened, really listened, we might have built a world more resilient, more grounded, less surprised by its own reflection. Instead, we remain shocked by every betrayal, every fall from grace, every leader who speaks of justice but acts in shadows. And still we ask, how could this happen? Machiavelli answered that question 500 years ago. We just weren't ready to hear it. There is a strange kind of wisdom that lives in the shadows, not because it loves darkness, but because it understands that light without shadow is an illusion. Machiavelli did not step into history to celebrate cruelty or betrayal. He stepped forward because he believed that clarity was a higher virtue than comfort. His writings were not weapons, they were mirrors. And perhaps that is why they have endured. Because long after the princes fell, after the cities he knew changed their flags, after the empires he wrote about crumbled into dust, one thing remained: human nature. The fragile, complex, often contradictory nature of people, always dreaming of goodness, always capable of violence, always walking the line between their higher ideals and their lower fears. Machiavelli never asked us to love the darkness. He asked us to see it, to see the truth of things, not to be defeated by it, but to become free from its hold over us. Because the darkness we refuse to look at does not disappear, it controls us from the shadows. But the darkness we face with courage, that becomes wisdom. There is a quiet strength in knowing how the world works, without hatred, without despair, without becoming what you study. Machiavelli knew this strength. He knew that power is neither good nor evil. It simply amplifies the person who holds it. A good person who understands power can protect more than they destroy. A wise person who sees through illusions can lead without being led astray. A leader who faces reality without fear can act without cruelty because they have nothing to prove. Machiavelli was not teaching manipulation for its own sake. He was teaching survival, teaching clarity, teaching the art of moving through a world that does not reward innocence unless it is paired with strength. And in this, there is an unexpected compassion. He knew that humans are fragile, that our desires betray us, that our fears guide us when we are lost. He didn't judge this. He didn't moralize. He simply said, "This is what we are, And in doing so, he left behind a gift for those brave enough to accept it. The gift of lucidity, the gift of seeing the world as it is raw, beautiful, dangerous, alive. It takes courage to walk that path. It takes courage to lead without illusions. It takes courage to love people, not for what we want them to be, but for who they really are. This is the wisdom behind the darkness. To know the truth and to remain kind, to see the shadows and still choose light, to walk through power and not lose yourself. Machiavelli was never the villain. He was the messenger. And the message was never about corruption. It was about awakening. Not to fear life, but to understand it. Not to escape reality, but to master it. Not to surrender to the darkness, but to walk through it with your eyes open. And perhaps that is the final lesson of Machiavelli, the one most people missed. That honesty is not cruelty. That clarity is not evil. That truth, no matter how difficult, is always an act of love, even especially when it shows us what we did not want to see. Because that is where freedom lives, not in pretending, but in seeing, in knowing, and in choosing with full awareness the life you will create in a world that belongs not to angels, but to human beings, exactly as we are.